A staff car pulls up at a forward airstrip near Meiktila. It is May 1945. The temperature is over 40 degrees Celsius. The dust of central Burma coats everything. The man who climbs out is 53 years old, stocky, with a face that looks like it was carved from teak. He has spent 3 years rebuilding a shattered army from the wreckage of the worst defeat in British military history. He has just won the greatest British land victory of the Second World War. He has driven the Japanese out of Burma in what military historians now call the most brilliant campaign of manoeuvre by a British general in the 20th century. His 14th Army has killed or captured more Japanese soldiers than any other Allied force in any theatre. His name is William Slim, and he has just been informed that he is being sacked, not for losing, for winning so completely that the men above him, the men who had taken the credit and the headlines while he did the fighting, had decided he was no longer needed. Slim would later show a fellow officer his campaign dispatches on an aeroplane and say quietly, "You would not think they would sack a chap for doing that, would you?" To understand how the man who built the 14th Army, who destroyed a Japanese force of 85,000 at Imphal and Kohima, who conducted the longest opposed river crossing of the war, and who covered 200 miles in a single month in the race to Rangoon, found himself facing dismissal at the moment of his greatest triumph, you have to understand where he came from. Because William Slim was not supposed to be a general at all. He was not supposed to be an officer. By every rule of the British military establishment of his era, he should have spent his life as a clerk in a Birmingham metal tube factory, and the men who tried to remove him in May 1945 had never forgotten it. William Joseph Slim was born on the 6th of August 1891 in Bristol. His father, John Slim, was a wholesale ironmonger whose business later failed, plunging the family into financial difficulty. They moved to Birmingham. The Slims were lower middle class, a critical biographical fact that shaped everything that followed. While his contemporary Bernard Montgomery was the son of a bishop, educated at St Paul's School London and Sandhurst, Slim was the son of a self-employed metalworker. He did not attend Eton or Harrow. He did not go to Sandhurst. He did not attend university. His father's business failure meant only one son could afford higher education, and that was Slim's older brother. Slim attended King Edward's School, Birmingham, a respectable grammar school, but nothing like the public school backgrounds of the officer class. His first jobs were elementary school teacher in a Birmingham slum, and then junior clerk at Stewart's and Lloyd's, a metal tube manufacturing firm. This was not the background of a future field marshal. This was the background of a man the British Army would have rejected without a second glance. But Slim found a back door. In 1912, he managed to join the Birmingham University Officers Training Corps despite having no connection to the university. When war broke out in August 1914, he was commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant in the 9th Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment. The key word is temporary. He was not a proper officer. He was a wartime expedient. At Gallipoli in 1915, Slim was leading approximately 50 men attached to the 1st 6th Gurkha Rifles when he was shot through the chest, a near-fatal wound. The bullet passed through his lung. He was evacuated to England and initially discharged as medically unfit. A lesser man would have accepted that verdict gratefully. Slim fought his way back into the army. This was his first encounter with the Gurkhas, a connection that would define the rest of his career. In Mesopotamia, he was wounded again on the 29th of March 1917. He won the Military Cross on the 7th of February 1918. In Eritrea in 1941, commanding the 10th Indian Division, he would be wounded a third time, hit simultaneously by armour-piercing, incendiary and explosive bullets from an Italian fighter strafing his position. 3 wounds in 3 different wars. He kept coming back. But when the First World War ended and the army contracted, his chance of staying in was virtually zero. His MC was no match for his lack of proper credentials. The officer class closed ranks. So he transferred to the Indian Army, initially as a major in the 6th Gurkha Rifles. He also wrote short stories and novels under the pen name Anthony Mills to supplement his army pay. This was technically against regulations, but Slim needed the money. His father's failed business had left the family with nothing. I want to pause here because this matters. The Indian Army was where capable officers without the right background ended up. As one historian put it, Indian generals, though often more efficient and practical than their British Army equivalents, were usually distrusted by British headquarters and politicians. They were believed to be second-rate and middle class. This perception affected Slim's entire career. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Slim. Despite brilliant reports from his commanding officers, despite finishing first in his class at Staff College Quetta, Slim repeatedly made it to the next rank at the last possible moment before age would have disqualified him. Ronald Lewin, in his biography, Slim, the standard bearer, calls him Hitler's beneficiary, meaning his qualities for senior command would never have been recognised in peacetime. Churchill himself, on hearing Slim's name, reportedly quipped, "I cannot believe that a man with a name like Slim can be much good. This is the man who would go on to win Britain's greatest battle." When the Japanese invaded Burma in January 1942, the British position collapsed with stunning speed. The Japanese had 2 divisions. They faced a force that looked larger on paper, but was scattered, poorly trained for jungle warfare, and operating on the assumption that the jungle was impassable. The Japanese walked straight through it. Rangoon fell on the 8th of March. Slim was brought in from commanding the 10th Indian Division in Iraq to take over Burma Corps at Prome on the 19th of March. He arrived to find an army already in retreat, its commander Alexander trying to hold an impossible line, its supply system collapsing, its morale shattered. What followed was the longest retreat in British military history. 900 miles through jungle and mountains with no air cover, facing an enemy who had outmanoeuvred, outfought and outgeneraled the British at every turn. The Japanese moved faster, hit harder, and consistently appeared on British flanks before the British knew they were coming. Slim's own words, "From defeat into victory, we, the Allies, had been outmanoeuvred, outfought, and outgeneraled. Burma Corps casualties totaled 13,000 killed, wounded, and missing from a force of 42,000. Only 28 field guns remained out of 150. Japanese casualties for the entire conquest of Burma were under 5,000. The disparity was catastrophic. The army that reached India was, in Slim's phrase, utterly exhausted, riddled with malaria and dysentery. They might look like scarecrows, he wrote, but they looked like soldiers too. Slim was angry that his men received no welcome, no recognition. The BEF had been celebrated after Dunkirk. Speeches were made, medals were awarded. The men who had retreated 1,000 miles through the Burmese jungle got nothing. No bands, no parades. They were simply absorbed into the camps of eastern India and forgotten. In those days, Slim later wrote, "If anyone had gone to me with a single piece of good news, I would have burst out crying. Nobody ever did, and then it got worse." In 1942 and 43, the British forces in India faced a catastrophe that had nothing to do with the Japanese. Disease. For every 1 man evacuated wounded, 120 were evacuated sick. The malaria rate was 84% per year of total troop strength, over 5,000 malaria cases per day at peak. During the first Arakan offensive, 90% of casualties were from malaria. Dysentery, typhus and skin diseases accounted for thousands more. The medical services were doing their best, but the problem was not medical. It was leadership. Troops were not taking their mipacrine tablets. They were not using mosquito nets. They were drinking untreated water. Officers were treating disease as a medical problem rather than a command problem. Slim's response reveals everything about his approach to command. He placed responsibility for disease control squarely on officers, not medics. "Good doctors are no use without good discipline," he declared. "More than half the battle against disease is fought not by doctors, but by regimental officers." He enforced daily mipacrine tablets as a matter of military discipline, not optional, not advisory, mandatory. If mipacrine was not taken, he said, I sacked the commander. I only had to sack 3. By then, the rest had got my meaning. The malaria rate dropped from 84% to less than 5%, a tenfold reduction. This was one of the most dramatic medical military reforms in history, and it was achieved not through medical innovation but through leadership. No new drugs, no new equipment, just a commander who understood that discipline is the foundation of everything else. Slim had a phrase he used constantly. There are no bad regiments, there are only bad officers. He believed it absolutely. When something went wrong, he looked first at the commander, not the men. I think this tells you more about Slim than any battlefield triumph. He understood that an army is a system, and that systems fail or succeed based on the decisions of commanders, not the heroism of individuals. He was a manager as much as a warrior, and in the jungles of Burma that was exactly what was needed. The 14th Army was formally created in October 1943. Slim was appointed its commander in early December. It would become the largest Commonwealth army of the war, approximately 750,000 men at its peak, with some estimates placing the number closer to 1 million when all supporting elements are counted. Only 13% were ethnically British. The rest were Indian, Gurkha, African, and Burmese, troops from more than 20 nations speaking over 100 languages, with 32 separate ration scales to accommodate different dietary requirements. This was, quite possibly, the most racially and religiously diverse army in the 20th century. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians, animists, men from the plains of the Punjab and the mountains of Nepal and the forests of West Africa, and it was commanded by a man who, unlike most British generals of his era, had no prejudices about the virtues of one race over another. Professor Norman Dixon, in On the Psychology of Military Incompetence, noted that Slim was unusually non-ethnocentric for a senior commander of his time. He wore the Gurkha slouch hat, which became the headgear of the entire 14th Army. He spoke Urdu and Gurkhali fluently. A Gurkha rifleman named Bajbir Gurung served as his personal orderly and bodyguard from 1942 onwards, and would remain with him for the rest of his life. His troops knew him as Uncle Bill. Approximately 87% of his largely Indian, Gurkha, and African army knew him as Chacha Slim Sahib. I cannot emphasize enough how unusual this was. It would be, as Robert Lyman observed, inconceivable to think of Field Marshal Montgomery as Uncle Bernard, but Uncle Bill came naturally. Slim visited forward units constantly. He talked to soldiers, not at them. He listened. His speech to officers about leadership has been quoted in military academies ever since. Officers are there to lead, he told them. As officers, you will neither eat nor drink nor sleep nor smoke nor even sit down until you have personally seen that your men have done those things. If you will do this for them, they will follow you to the end of the world, and if you do not, I will break you. The 14th Army called itself the Forgotten Army, a name that stuck. They fought on the Forgotten Front, thousands of miles from London, with the lowest priority for equipment, reinforcements, and press attention. The best aircraft went to Europe. The best tanks went to Montgomery. The 14th Army got what was left over. SEAC, Southeast Asia Command, was sarcastically nicknamed Save England's Asiatic Colonies. The men in Burma knew exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of British priorities. February 1944, the admin box. This was where everything would be tested. The Japanese 55th Division launched Operation Hargo, planning to destroy 15th Corps within 10 days. Japanese forces infiltrated behind Allied lines and overran the 7th Indian Division headquarters. They expected panic. They expected retreat. They expected what had always happened before. Here is where Slim's reforms were tested. In 1942, this would have triggered a panicked retreat. The jungle was enemy territory. The Japanese were supermen. Everyone knew that. But in 1944, the troops stood firm. Slim's new doctrine was simple. Form defensive boxes, dig in, and hold. You will be supplied by air. Do not retreat. All personnel, cooks, clerks, muleteers, were trained to fight. Every man had a rifle. Every man knew how to use it. On the night of the 7th of February, Japanese troops broke into the main dressing station and slaughtered 35 medical staff and patients. A war crime that hardened Allied resolve rather than breaking it. The fighting was hand-to-hand. Lee Grant tanks of the 25th Dragoons proved decisive. RAF and USAAF Dakotas dropped over 1,600 tons of supplies. When the 5th Indian Division broke through the Ngakyadok Pass on the 24th of February, Allied casualties stood at approximately 3,000. Japanese casualties exceeded 5,000 dead. It was the first major defeat inflicted on the Japanese army in the theatre. Slim called it one of the historic successes of British arms. It was the turning point in the Burma campaign, but the real test was coming. In March 1944, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation U-Go, what he called the March on Delhi. 85,000 Japanese troops would invade India, seize the British supply bases at Imphal, and cut the road at Kohima. Mutaguchi's plan relied on speed, seize British supplies before Japanese logistics collapsed. The siege of Kohima began on the 4th of April. The garrison comprised only approximately 2,500 men, half of them combat troops, facing 15,000 Japanese under Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato. The odds were 6-1 against. The defenders included the 4th Battalion, the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, Assam Rifles, and various composite units scraped together from rear echelon troops. What followed was some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The famous tennis court battle saw opposing forces dug in on either side of the Deputy Commissioner's tennis court, separated by its width, throwing grenades across. A soldier of the Queen's Royal Regiment described it as the nearest approach to a snowball fight that could be imagined. The air was thick with grenades, both theirs and ours. Men died within feet of each other for a strip of turf that measured roughly 24 by 11 metres. By mid-April, the garrison held only 350 square metres of ground. Water supply was lost. Men crawled out at night to get water from a spring only 30 yards from a Japanese position. They could hear the Japanese talking. Some did not make it back. At Imphal, the 17th Indian Division fought through 4 Japanese roadblocks on the Tiddim Road between the 18th and 25th of March. On the 13th of April, M3 Lee tanks and the 5th Indian Division recaptured Nungshigam Ridge, the critical hill overlooking the main airstrip. By the 1st of May, all Japanese attacks had been halted, but the siege continued. The air supply operation was unprecedented in the history of warfare. Think about what Slim was attempting. 2 entire corps, the 4th and 33rd, cut off from ground supply lines, fighting a battle of annihilation against 85,000 Japanese troops, supplied entirely by air. 19,000 tons of supplies flown in, 12,000 men flown in as reinforcements, 13,000 casualties evacuated by air, 43,000 non-combatants evacuated, over 1 million gallons of fuel delivered, 1,000 bags of mail, 40 million cigarettes. The aircraft flew multiple sorties per day, often in monsoon conditions, often under fire. Without this air bridge, Imphal and Kohima would have fallen. The Japanese knew this. Their entire strategy depended on capturing the British supply dumps before their own logistics collapsed. They failed. Slim's preparation, his stockpiling, his coordination with the RAF and USAAF made the difference. On the 22nd of June 1944, the siege was broken. The 2nd British Division met the 5th Indian Division at milestone 109 on the Dimapur to Imphal Road. The junction happened quietly. There were no dramatic scenes, just exhausted men shaking hands on a jungle road. 11 days later, the Japanese formally broke off their offensive and began their retreat. But retreat is too gentle a word. What followed was a rout. The Japanese 15th Army dissolved. Men starved. Men drowned trying to cross the monsoon-swollen Chindwin. Men shot themselves rather than be taken prisoner. The road back to Burma was littered with corpses. Slim described the Japanese at this moment in characteristically blunt terms. "We had to kill 495 before it was ours," he said of one position, and then the last 5 had killed themselves. The numbers tell the story. Japanese casualties at Imphal and Kohima totaled approximately 53,000 dead and missing out of 85,000 committed. Less than a third of the force returned. Mutaguchi was relieved of command. 3 of his division commanders were sacked. 2 of them had openly refused to continue his offensive. One had simply marched his division away from Kohima without orders. It was the largest defeat in Japanese military history to that date. 5 Japanese divisions were destroyed, 2 more badly mauled. 17,000 pack animals lost. British and Indian casualties totaled approximately 16,500. In 2013, the National Army Museum asked the public to vote on Britain's greatest battle. They chose Imphal and Kohima ahead of D-Day and Waterloo. This was not nostalgia. This was recognition. Mountbatten himself described it as probably one of the greatest battles in history. The British-Indian Thermopylae. Here is where the pattern I keep returning to on this channel becomes undeniable. Slim had won one of the decisive battles of the Second World War, but he was not a celebrity. He did not court the press. He did not have royal connections or an Eton education. He was an Indian army officer who wore a battered Gurkha hat and talked to private soldiers as equals. And above him, at Southeast Asia Command headquarters in Kandy, Ceylon, sat Lord Mountbatten. This is the part the official histories gloss over. Mountbatten was everything Slim was not. Great-grandson of Queen Victoria, second cousin of King George VI, born literally in a royal residence at Frogmore House, Windsor. His previous appointment had been Chief of Combined Operations, where he had overseen the Dieppe raid in August 1942. That operation had cost 3,600 casualties out of 6,000 troops committed, a 60% casualty rate with nothing to show for it. The Canadians who did the dying never forgave him. He was appointed Supreme Commander Southeast Asia at the Quebec Conference in August 1943 at the age of 43, the youngest Supreme Commander of the war. There were complaints of nepotism. His qualifications for the post were primarily political, not military. The headquarters at Kandy was established in the Royal Botanical Gardens at Peradeniya, a lush 147-acre tropical paradise. It was 1,500 to 2,000 miles from the Burma front. Robert Lyman criticised it as vastly overstaffed by bright young things, which allowed him to bask in their admiration. Mountbatten had approximately 7,000 staff officers at Kandy. Slim ran the 14th Army with a fraction of that number. Mountbatten was, in the phrase of one historian, famous for his media savviness and for his propensity for showmanship. He established a newspaper called SEAC, a magazine called Phoenix, Radio SEAC, broadcasting across the theatre, and commissioned the documentary film Burma Victory. That documentary tells you everything you need to know about where credit was going. The first 50 minutes focused on Mountbatten, Orde Wingate, General Stilwell, and General Sir Oliver Leese. Slim made a brief appearance in the film's last 10 minutes. Veterans of the 14th Army who watched it were, according to contemporary accounts, puzzled and appalled. And if this sounds familiar, if you have watched someone at the top take credit for the work done by people below them, you are not imagining it. The British military in 1944 ran on the same principles as every other British institution of the era: the right school, the right family, the right connections. After Imphal and Kohima, Slim faced a strategic problem. His original plan was to cross the Chindwin and destroy the Japanese in the Shwibo Plain north of the Irrawaddy. But General Kimura, the new Japanese commander who had replaced the disgraced Mutaguchi, was more competent than his predecessor. He withdrew his forces behind the Irrawaddy, destroying Slim's plan at a stroke. The Japanese would not fight where Slim wanted them to fight. Slim's response was Operation Extended Capital, what historians now call his masterpiece of operational manoeuvre. The plan was audacious. 33rd Corps under Lieutenant General Montague Stopford would make conspicuous crossings north of Mandalay, drawing Japanese attention and reserves. Meanwhile, 4th Corps under Lieutenant General Frank Messervy would secretly switch flanks. They would march down the Gangor Valley, building their own road through jungle as they went. They would cross the Irrawaddy near Pakoku, far to the south of where the Japanese expected, and they would seize Meiktila, the Japanese logistics hub 90 miles south of Mandalay. Without Meiktila, the Japanese army in Burma would starve. A dummy 4th Corps headquarters was established at Tamu using the same wireless channels. Signals were routed through the dummy headquarters to maintain the illusion that 4th Corps was still in its original position. The deception worked perfectly. On the 14th of February 1945, the 7th Indian Division crossed the Irrawaddy at Nyangu near the ancient temple city of Pagan. The river was 3 times wider than the Rhine. It was one of the longest opposed river crossings of the Second World War. The troops crossed in assault boats, on improvised rafts, on anything that would float. The 17th Indian Division with the 255th Indian Tank Brigade broke out from the bridgehead on the 20th of February. On the 26th of February, they captured the vital airfield at Thabutkhon. Japanese High Command dismissed initial reports. Someone deleted a 0 from 2,000 vehicles approaching Meiktila, thinking it was merely a raid. By the 5th of March, Meiktila was in British hands. The Japanese sent 8 regiments to recapture it. They failed. On the 20th of March, the 19th Indian Division captured Mandalay. 4th Corps then advanced south at extraordinary speed, covering 200 miles in a month. Key towns fell in rapid succession: Piabwe, Pianmana, Tungu, Pegu. By the 1st of May, 4th Corps was 30 to 40 miles from Rangoon when stopped by rearguards and the approaching monsoon. On the 1st of May, a Gurkha parachute battalion dropped on Elephant Point. The next day, the 26th Indian Division conducted an amphibious assault. The Japanese had already evacuated. Prisoners of war at Rangoon Central Jail had painted on the roof the words, "Japs gone and extract digit." Rangoon was fully occupied on the 3rd of May. The monsoon rains began in full force. They had captured the city just in time. Jack Bosher, in his book Forgotten Armour, wrote of this campaign. Had it been carried out by Monty, Patton, Rommel or Zhukov, it would be as well known as the Battle for France, Alamein, Kursk or Overlord. Professor Raymond Callaghan called the campaign that carried Slim from the borders of Burma to Rangoon the greatest feat of operational manoeuvre by a British general in the 20th century, and this was the moment, in May 1945, when they tried to sack him. The man who delivered the news was Lieutenant General Sir Oliver Leese, 3rd Baronet, educated at Ludgrove and Eton, Coldstream Guards, commanded 30th Corps under Montgomery at El Alamein, appointed Commander-in-Chief Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia in November 1944. Robert Lyman's assessment is damning. He came out with the idea of commanding the armies in Southeast Asia without realising or recognising at any stage that the entire conception for victory in the Far East was Slim's. Slim had been building up progressively the idea that the Japanese could be defeated, doctrinally and practically, from 1942. The entire origins and basis of success in 1944 and 45 had begun way back in 1942 by Slim. Without Slim, none of this would have happened. Leese did not understand any of this. He came into the fray with the natural arrogance of his class, and with the 8th Army experience behind him, and said, "I am in charge." Leese proposed to Mountbatten and to CIGS Alan Brooke that Slim should be replaced as 14th Army commander by Lieutenant General Philip Christison. The rationale was that Christison had amphibious warfare experience better suited for planned landings in Malaya. Slim would be offered the newly formed 12th Army for mopping up operations in Burma, effectively a demotion. Mountbatten initially authorised the proposals. Leese persuaded Mountbatten that Slim was tired and needed a break. Mountbatten sent a message to London saying that a new army commander was required. On the 7th of May, Leese flew to Slim's headquarters at Meiktila and delivered what Slim later called the astounding news. The timing could not have been worse. Rangoon had fallen 4 days earlier. The campaign was won, and now this. Slim refused the appointment. He said he would prefer to retire from the army. He told his staff he had been sacked. He wrote to Leese and to General Sir Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief India, to say he would refuse the new post and resign in protest. He showed a fellow general his campaign dispatches and asked quietly, "You would not think they would sack a chap for doing that, would you?" Once the news circulated within the 14th Army, the reaction was immediate and furious. Mutinies and mass resignations of officers were threatened. The army that Slim had built, that had followed him from defeat to victory, that trusted him as they trusted no other commander, fell into turmoil. Senior officers made clear they would not serve under Christison if Slim were removed. Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, was furious at not having been consulted. He immediately recognised this as a serious mistake. You do not swap horses midstream. And he was smart enough to realise that the great victories at Imphal and Kohima in 1944 were Slim's. Brooke sent a message back to Mountbatten. "Stop this nonsense now, sack Leese, and put Slim in his place." Mountbatten, although he had authorised the original proposals, now refused to support Leese. The Supreme Commander switched sides. The outcome was total reversal. On the 1st of July 1945, Slim was promoted to full general and appointed to succeed Leese as Commander-in-Chief Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia. Leese was sacked and returned to the United Kingdom as GOC in Sea Eastern Command, a significant downward move. His promotion to full general was reportedly blocked by Mountbatten. This was the second time Slim had been promoted to replace the man who sacked him. The first was Noel Irwin in 1943, whose terse message to Slim had been, "You are not sacked. I am." Richard Meade, in Churchill's Lions, rendered a verdict on the affair. Leese was naive, Slim petulant, and Mountbatten devious. Devious specifically due to switching positions from supporting to opposing Leese. Robert Lyman's verdict is harsher. The plot, such as it was masterminded by Mountbatten, and poor old Oliver Leese, who was but the messenger, like the loyal guardie that he was, shouldered the blame. Mountbatten, in my judgment, let him take the fall. I find it telling that the Rangoon Victory Parade on the 15th of June 1945, which Mountbatten staged to celebrate the conquest of Burma, featured Mountbatten taking the salute. Slim, the architect of the victory, was not present. Let me give you the final numbers, because in the end, the numbers are what matter. Total Japanese dead across the Burma campaign, approximately 185,000 to 190,000, according to Louis Allen's estimate in Burma, the longest war. This was more Japanese dead than in any other single theatre of the war, more than Guadalcanal, more than Iwo Jima, more than Okinawa. 14th Army total casualties through the entire campaign, 167,000 killed, wounded, and missing. But not a single gun was lost in the advance from Imphal to Rangoon. Not one. Territory recovered, 261,000 square miles, all of Burma. Campaign duration, December 1941 to August 1945, 3 years and 8 months. It was, as Allen titled his book, the longest war. In the sitting breakout in July 1945, after Rangoon had fallen, the Japanese attempted to break out eastwards towards Thailand. Slim's forces had captured their plans. 10,000 of the 18,000 Japanese were killed. The 14th Army knew exactly where they would be, and when. Slim's official dispatches mentioned Mountbatten by name 11 times. Mountbatten's official dispatches mentioned himself 93 times. In 2011, the National Army Museum asked the public to vote on Britain's greatest general. They chose William Slim, tied with the Duke of Wellington. What happened to Slim after the war tells you something about how the establishment eventually comes around when competence is undeniable. It takes time. It takes the old guard dying off. But eventually merit wins. He was passed over for the post of CIGS in 1946. Montgomery got it instead. But in November 1948, when Montgomery's term ended, there was only one candidate. Slim was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the first officer who had served in the Indian Army ever to hold that post. The ironmonger's son from Birmingham had reached the highest position in the British Army. He was promoted to Field Marshal on the 4th of January 1949. He served as Governor-General of Australia from 1953 to 1960, where he was enormously popular. The Australians, who had fought alongside his 14th Army, knew exactly who he was and what he had done. He was created Viscount Slim in 1960 and Knight of the Garter in 1959, one of the highest honours the monarch can bestow. Both Nehru and Jinnah offered him senior positions after Indian independence. Nehru wanted him as first Commander-in-Chief of independent India's army. Jinnah offered him the governorship of East Pakistan. He declined both, testimony to the respect he commanded across the subcontinent, among men of all backgrounds and all faiths. He died on the 14th of December 1970, aged 79. His body lay in state in St George's Chapel, Windsor. The Queen attended his funeral. Gurkhas lined the route. Philip Ziegler, Mountbatten's authorised biographer, wrote of his subject, his faults, like everything else about him, were on the grandest scale. His vanity, though childlike, was monstrous, his ambition unbridled. He sought to rewrite history with cavalier indifference to the facts to magnify his own achievements. Mountbatten himself, to his credit, called Slim the finest general World War II produced. Max Hastings wrote, "In contrast to almost every other outstanding commander of the war, Slim was a disarmingly normal human being, possessed of notable self-knowledge. He was without pretension. His blunt honesty, lack of bombast and unwillingness to play courtier did him few favours in the corridors of power. Only his soldiers never wavered in their devotion. I think George MacDonald Fraser, who served under Slim as a 19-year-old lance colonel in the 14th Army, captured it best in his memoir, Quartered Safe Out Here. He had a force that came out of him, a strength of personality. British soldiers do not love their commanders, much less worship them. 14th Army trusted Slim and thought of him as one of themselves, and perhaps his real secret was that the feeling was mutual. He had the head of a general, Fraser concluded, with the heart of a private soldier. That is what the establishment never understood. That is what Leese and Mountbatten, with their Eton educations and their royal connections and their staff cars and their tropical headquarters, could never comprehend. You cannot buy loyalty. You cannot inherit it. You can only earn it. Slim earned it. In the jungles and the mountains and the monsoon rains of Burma, leading the forgotten army on the forgotten front, he earned it. Slim closed his own book, Defeat into Victory, with these words: "To the soldiers of the many races who, in the comradeship of the 14th Army, did go on, and to the airmen who flew with them and fought over them, belongs the true glory of achievement. It was they who turned defeat into victory." The Kohima Memorial bears an epitaph that has become one of the most famous in British military history. It was composed by John Maxwell Edmonds, based on the epitaph of the Spartans at Thermopylae. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." 17,000 Allied soldiers are buried in the Commonwealth war cemeteries at Kohima and Imphal. Most of them were Indian. Many were Gurkha. They fought for a country that was not their own, under a general who treated them as equals, and they won. If your father or grandfather served in the 14th Army, with the Gurkhas, with the Indian divisions, with the West African brigades, in Arakan, at Kohima, at Imphal, in the advance to Rangoon, I would like to hear about it.